So Scott Smith is the full name.
Mm-hmm.
And so could you describe me, we'll just start from the beginning, what was your childhood like, and just go from there.
Yeah, well, I'm the pastor down here at Waterbrook Community Church in what I call North Myrtle Beach. Uh, just basically a suburb of North Myrtle Beach. And we ended up here because I was born and raised in High Point, North Carolina. Actually born in Greenville, but we moved here when I was a couple of months old, so moved to High Point. And High Point has one of these little sleepy mill towns in North Carolina. The saying is it's a great place to raise kids, but it's a lousy place to grow up. So it was really boring. I had a typical kind of childhood, I guess, if you could call it typical. I had an older brother, he's 3 years older than me. My mom and dad were married, and we went to church every Sunday, to which was one of these deals where never really into it like most kids, just kind of went through the motions. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. My parents wondered why I was always flying off the walls and bouncing every which way, and they just thought I was hyperactive. But being ADHD, it was at a time in the in the early to mid 70s, to where nobody had heard anything about ADHD. So a lot of the things that I ran into in school, I fell behind in school really early. Of course, school was never my thing to begin with. I was a solid CD student anyway, even when I was early on going in primary school. Never really liked school, never really liked the structure of it. It didn't resonate with me on any level, with the exception of the social level of it, I think. And then when I got older in middle school and high school, it was more about the social parts of it and the sports. That was the only reason that I went to school. I would have quit school probably when I was 13, 14 years old and just never went back had it not been for those two things. But being ADHD, I was constantly behind in my studies. Always felt like the academics were just never my cup of tea. Just couldn't handle it. So I always felt inadequate. I felt like then some insecurities probably crept into my life too. Not being able to keep up with some of my friends as far as their grades, to not really wanting to show my report cards to my parents. Because as a child, I feel like even if you don't want to as a parent, I feel like so much of what your perception of things is how you perform in school. And how you do in school. If you're a straight A student, you get a lot of accolades. If you're in beta club or honor classes or something, you don't get a lot of praises at report card times for C's and D's. And that's what I was constantly bringing home. And the problem with it is that there were some classes and some years where I was actually working hard and trying my best, and then still not seeing in the results either. So I think that was part of it. My parents first got separated when I was like maybe second or third grade, but then they got back together and they stayed together up into my teenage years.
Got it.
Yeah.
How was your relationship with them, I guess, as you got older, with the grades and just going into high school, and with all that, how was y'all's relationship?
My parents were always supporting of me, and I feel like they were probably just as frustrated early on in my formidable years when I was in elementary school. They were just as frustrated at the fact. My brother is your typical first son. He's your typical overachiever. He always made A's and B's, and then I come along and can't even scratch out a C. So I think they kind of knew that I had some challenges. They saw that I was willing to work sometimes. There were some studies that I really excelled at, like history. Believe it or not, I loved history, the stories of it, and And, you know, PE, I was always good for an A in PE. So that was always, you know, I think for my parents, they were really supportive. I have the best dad in the world and the best mom at that particular time, too, for what I was going through as a teenager. It's just that you get to a point to where I feel like everybody just kind of, they know, but they don't want to say it. You know, they're like, this is just going to be how it's going to be until he gets out of high school. Hopefully we can just get him out of high school. The biggest, most formidable thing that happened to me during my teen years was probably my parents' divorce. My parents divorced when I was 14. And my brother, since he was older, 3 years older, he left for college the same year. So that was when I started to go sideways with some of my behaviors and some of the crowd that I was running with.
So you're saying that you think that had a big effect on your decision making?
Yeah, that was probably a watershed moment for me. There was a traumatic experience that happened with the police and them being called over to our house, and I just remember my mom being hauled off, and I remember that particular point making a decision in my life, in my head, that it was such an emotional turmoil for me that I just said, you know, I'm just never going to love anybody else like this, because love, basically, it hurts when you allow yourself to trust. And, you know, for a 14-year-old, and I probably was not emotionally mature enough to handle it. I don't know if anybody is at 14. I think some kids are probably more emotional stable to handle it. Me already having some insecurities, that just accentuated those things, and it just kind of blew them open. And so from that point on, I remember making a conscious decision that night that I was never going to trust anybody or really allow them into my close inner circle from that point on. So I think that affected my relationships from that point on, as far as I would hold everybody at an arm's distance. And if you got too close, I would personally sabotage the relationship just to have it blowing up later. You know, I would want to take control over it and just kind of personally sabotage it, which really led to, at that particular age, 14, 15, 16, I started running with a crowd of people that were they were more in line with what I felt at that time too. But that's when the seeds, I think, of anger and resentment and bitterness just kind of came in. And I think that's when I started to deal with depression on a certain level too. Didn't know what it was. Again, at the time, it was one of those, depression at that time, unlike today where it's talked about a lot, it was unheard of. I mean, to bring it out in the open, it was unheard of. It was stuff you discussed with a psychologist or something like that. But if anybody would have found out that you were going to even see somebody for depression, there would have been a definite stigma attached to it. But that, I think for my parents, they were really supportive. They just thought I was kind of going through those rebellious teenage years when there was probably a lot more emotional things happening to me, rather than just acting out in a behavior kind of way. There were some deep-seated things that were getting going there. Yeah, and I didn't realize it at the time either. Being 14, you know, how would you?
So this is probably a question that may reoccur a couple times throughout the interview, but how did you view God, or what did you ever think about God in the middle of all that, or at that age?
You know, I had the church we went to was a big Methodist church in High Point, and I had a youth pastor at that time, Barry Osborne, who was a great youth pastor. And I remember at like 12 years old at a camp retreat making a decision for Jesus, you know, but as a 12-year-old boy, I didn't do anything with it. I just made the commitment. I think at that time it was sincere as I could possibly be. And looking back on it, I can see where God honored that at that particular time, even though I didn't. Yeah. You know, the rest of when I got to be 14, I basically quit youth group and just started running, you know, with a different crowd that wasn't obviously a church crowd. Yeah. And so for me at that particular point, I didn't think a lot about God. As a matter of fact, I was probably forming some opinions there that were even, because I'd been hurt through my parents' divorce, I was probably forming some opinions there that was more along the atheist, running, even though I had made that commitment, and even though I'd been grounded in religion and been grounded in Christianity specifically, I was probably starting to form more of a negative view of God at that time, just because the circumstances surrounding my life at that time too. So,
Yeah.
and the hurt. I was basing some of my beliefs and opinions out of pain and hurt and frustration, rather than coming at it in a sensible way too. But as a kid, I think you kind of play the hand you're dealt when it comes to that, and that was where I was at with it at that particular time. Yeah.
So I guess moving forward from there, how did kind of life go after that, the 14, 15?
14, 15, 16, into my 20s, I would start to develop an affair with and a relationship, a very detrimental relationship with alcohol. A lot of marijuana use on a daily basis, probably 2-3 times smoking pot, I would say, all the way through until when I was in my 30s. And in my early 20s, starting to deal certain drugs, cocaine, starting to experiment with acid, starting to experiment with hallucinogenics, and just doing, I was like what I call a human garbage can. I would just use and experience with anything that kind of came into my radar and my circumference. At that particular time though, during those years, mainstays were always marijuana, alcohol, and my drug of choice is, for what people say at that matter, is cocaine. In my early 20s, now at the age of 25, that all changes and it all shifts when I get introduced to freebase and cocaine. And then I would freebase and smoke crack from the ages of 26 to the ages of probably around 24 to 25 to about 31. There's about a 7 or 8 year use of just hard smoking crack, and that would lead me to just depths that I never thought in my life would take me to. And this is coming from a kid too that, my childhood, I was an Eagle Scout. I ended up being an Eagle Scout. So I was an all-conference soccer player in high school. So there was some functionality to it too, So there's almost this mirage effect that's taken on that everybody else sees. Well, he can be a wild child and stuff like that, but there's some parts of it that he's got under control, and it kind of gives you this false illusion that you can do it and handle it and still kind of barely maintain well enough.
Seem like you're doing all right to everybody else.
Yeah, and so at the age of 18 and stuff, there were some troubling signs there that really should have tipped me off, and they probably were tipping off some other people too. I was just too, at that time you're 18, you're just oblivious to it. You're just trying to live life and figure it out. In the midst of everything else that's going on. But at 25, that's kind of a watershed moment that I usually point to in my drug uses. That's a watershed moment where things really start to go off a cliff quickly. Yeah, that's where I get involved with, I'm involved in a relationship there. I get married to my first wife, and she's a drug addict as well, and so we kind of feed off of each other too. I would go, again, I'm functioning barely. I'm in sales, so I'm making good money in sales, which really is detrimental to my drug use.
Functioning.
Yeah, then it gets to the point to where I can't even hold a job anymore. So from the ages of 28 to 31, I'm basically living on the streets. I'm hustling, stealing, scamming, and I end up working for one of the biggest crack dealers, probably in our general area at that time. And so my habit goes from smoking a little bit every day of crack to smoking $200 to $300 a day habit. And from that point, you can't do anything but just feed your habit. So that's when I become homeless, living on the streets, and break it off with my wife, my first wife at that particular time, break it off with her, and just it goes downhill really, really quick.
What would you say, I guess, your lowest point within the addiction? Because there's an outside view of what someone's lowest point is, but
yeah, for me, there's too many low points really to pick from, but I guess that there's a low point when you're sleeping in your car, when you're I just remember a policeman knocking on my door one February morning. I was sleeping in a parking lot, and it was in the middle of an ice storm, and he just knocking on it with the end of his flashlight, and he was just checking to see if the person in the car was still alive, basically, I think, or if there was something, somebody in trouble. And he just said, "Man, you can't stay out here doing this. You're going to die like this." And I just remember thinking to myself then, I wish I would die. I wish I would die. I remember having these weird I would stay up for 3, 4, 5 days. I think the longest I ever stayed up was an 8-day bender. And I just remember at the end of some of these benders just begging God to kill me. I just remember thinking, if you're real, then you can kill me right now. Why won't you do that? Because at the end of that, at the end of addictions, when you're getting to that bottom point, you get to the point to where you realize that it's either death or jail. And I guess I was probably too much of a coward to kill myself. And I didn't want to go to jail. So you're just left in this constant state of hopelessness. And you just, people that are on the outside looking in, I think for them it's so easy to say, well, why don't you just quit using the drugs and get off the drugs and get yourself cleaned up? And but when you're in the throes of it, it has got you in such a grip that you can't see beyond. You can't see a day of sobriety. You can't see a day of going a couple of hours without using. So that's what it was like for me. My using became my job. That was what I did, and that went on for 2.5 years. Just constantly not being able to keep a job, scamming, just living a life. When I look back on it now, 20 some years removed, it seems like a bad dream, but it was my life, and that's what I was living at that particular time. Yeah. And
you mentioned how you were saying, God, if you're real, you would just end it. So I'd imagine there was still somewhat of a belief at that time.
Yeah, there was. And what's crazy is that I would actually carry a Bible in my car with me. And occasionally I would find myself, when I was really high or stuff, I would find myself sometimes reading it, making a futile attempt, I think, in my mind to reach out to God in some way, hoping for a magic wand type effect, a miracle type, you're healed kind of deal, all the while not knowing any way or just totally clueless to how the whole relationship with God worked. I was just trying to use God to kind of get me out of jail free card, kind of that thing too. And in a futile way, I was just thinking, if God is real, maybe he can get me out of this, so, but I didn't really, I didn't really buy into the whole, religion thing at this particular point. I had been so far removed from it at this point. There were traces of it and hints of it, but for the most part, it was just out of sight, out of mind.
In that world, I don't know if you were in rehabs or outpatient programs or anything like that. I assume somewhere along the way, some people would kind of throw like, Jesus can heal you, God can just turn to God. How did you respond to those people at that period of time?
Yeah, that was always, I bounced in and out of rehabs too. I mean, giving you the nutshell version, but I went to about 7 or 8 different rehabs. But when you're living on the streets and when you're trying to just make do, I would go to court-appointed rehabs that would last for sometimes as long as 2 weeks, sometimes as long as 3 days. I was bouncing in and out of trouble with the law, and was arrested 6 to 8 times by the time I was 22. So I had seen, just scrapes with the law and stuff like that, DUIs too. By the time I was 28, I had 4 DUIs in 3 different states. So, alcohol was a huge problem. So I was doing a lot of these court mandated kind of deals. And every time I would go to an AA or an NA meeting, I'd go out and use. And I just remember thinking, this isn't helping. I mean, this is, all it does is make me want to use. And so I knew I had tried so many things. I had an idea of some things. I thought that this just isn't going to work. And for AA and NA, for me, now it works for other people, but for me, it just, it couldn't fill that void in my life. As a matter of fact, it triggered the exact opposites for me. And when I would hear people say, God and Jesus and all that stuff, I'd go, yeah, it's great talk, but for me, if you can't have something tangible in your hands and use it, when the time comes, and when in the really difficult times too, when you want to use, then it's not applicable. So if it's not applicable for me, I just couldn't see the use of it. I couldn't see how that point with Jesus at point A could get me to point B. So to me, I would just kind of discard it and just go, that's for them, but it's not for me. I'm going to have to figure this out on my own. And I got myself into this. I'm going to have to get myself out. And then you go through the problems of trying to figure out a plan on your own. But then the problem is you try and fail and try and fail and try and fail. And you carry all that guilt and shame of each try and each failure. So you get to the point to where it's just self-defeating, to where you're just like, what's the point of trying anymore? I remember saying to myself one time too, I've tried to quit, and I just can't quit. I think my life's just always going to be like this. And so you're at a point to where you're just walking defeated. You can't see hope. You can't see a way out. And it's really, at that particular time, I didn't realize it, but I know now that I was deeply depressed and had been self-medicating myself at periods of depression. I had probably been depressed since I was about 14 or 15. So, yeah.
So I guess towards the end of the addiction, how did you said AA didn't work for you. What did work for you?
Nah. I had been given a card by, I don't even know where I got it. I think it was my dad, about this biker ministry called His Labor and Few Ministries in the town that I was in. And they ran a soup kitchen at that time. And it was like February, I think. It was during that ice storm. And I went in there just to get a hot meal and to get out of the weather and maybe find a place to crash or something that was warm for a night or two. And came back for a week and just to get free food and stuff. But the guys that were running it, the guys and gals that were running it, were all ex-Hells Angels or outlaw bikers. And so some of them had been drug addicts and they were clean. Well, I mean, I had met people that had been clean before too, but not like me. I mean, not in the sense that, I wasn't a biker, but in the sense that they had been through some horrible stuff just like I had, and they had walked a certain path, and in some cases even worse paths than I have, and they had pulled it out. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was sitting there thinking to myself, well, if they can do it, man, I can. I got a shot at this, right? So a week later, I put my name on a waiting list to get in there, and I was just doing it for this. I was doing it for two reasons: to get out of the cold, because it was getting really cold, and I thought, well, by the time I get out in 3 months, it'll be spring, summer. I'll be, clean, sober. I'll have saved some money, and I'll be back in business. I'll be back on my feet, and everything will be fine. So I did it for that reason, and I did it for the reason of, I think there was a part of me that said, you need to learn how to manage your addiction better. If you can just manage it, then you'll be fine.
So you didn't want to be done with it, you just wanted to manage it?
No, I wasn't down with the Jesus stuff, man. I just wanted Jesus to kind of give me some self-help, to kind of shave some rough edges off. And then, so I was willing to give Jesus about 85%, but I was going to keep about 15% for myself. So I went into it like that. Yeah. So 3 months later, I graduate the program. I made it a full 2 days before I went out and used again. And then so 6 months of using and just being absolutely crazy as far as my addiction. My addiction got far worse in those 6 months than it had ever gotten in 15 years. I'd become suicidal, or thinking a lot more about suicide. Hadn't tried to commit suicide, but was starting to think about it more. And it began shooting coke in my arm too. So not a lot, but I'd done it a couple of times, and I'd really enjoyed it. So I knew that my addiction was progressing down a dark, dark place that I probably wouldn't come out of. That's when I went back to His Labor and Fuel, because I sensed there was something there. And in October the 8th, 1998, I just made a decision then. There wasn't a preacher around, or I wasn't in a church service. I was in a little cinder block building with a cement floor, and I had the Bible open to John chapter. I don't even know what chapter, but I was reading it, and I just remembered this strong sense of wanting to commit my life to Christ and to really go all in. And so for 3 hours, I sat there and debated with God and talked it over, and I would say, I want to commit my life, and then I want to commit my life to you, Lord. And it was like I'd get this feeling that the Lord said, or my heart, something in my heart was saying, well, then you're going to have to give up this. And I go, well, hang on a minute then. Okay, hang on. You're going to have to give up the women. Well, hold on a minute. And wait. And then so, 15, 20 minutes later, I'd come back, and then I'd have to give up something else. And then it was this process for me of saying, I'm going to totally commit my life to Christ. I'm not going to give you 85%. I'm not even going to give you 90%. I want to give you the whole 100%. And October 8th, 1998 was the time where all that changed forever. It was just, it was this remarkable, and some people say, bells and whistles kind of all go off, and, you start seeing the world differently, and none of that happened to me. It was just, I still had, $20-some thousand in debt. I still had a marriage at that time that was on the rocks. I would learn 2 months later. My first wife would send me divorce papers in the mail to sign. So that marriage would be a casualty of my drug addiction. And I still had all the problems. I still had court dates to face. I still had, people I owed money, no job, no prospects. No family, no friends. I had my family loved me and supported me, but they weren't going to sit by and watch me, kill myself. So they had done the whole tough love thing and said, "Don't come around here anymore." And my friends, I had burned all those bridges. So my life on the exterior hadn't changed at all. It was still, it was still a dumpster fire on a train on a way to a wreck. I mean, it was still, all those things were still in place. But my perspective on life had changed, and my perspective on me was starting to change too. And I didn't little bit known to me that all these things, that God was starting to do a work in me that I couldn't even fathom, couldn't even imagine at that time.
Dedicated your life in that little cement building, and you had to give things up or realize what came with that, what it meant. And then from there, kind of what happened, like who was around you, how did that affect you, like who was there to, like, I guess as the new believer to help?
Yeah, so there were some men in my life at that particular time, my dad being one of them. Is a strong Christian influence, a wonderful godly man. My pastor at that time was a man by the name of Steve Irvin, who had been an outlaw motorcycle club member, and was a pretty intimidating figure, but he was a wonderful man of God, and his wife Carolyn, they became great friends of mine, and my future wife at that particular time too. And then there were just some other men that God put in my life at that time that were strong Christian guys. Another guy that was Bob McMillan, who we nicknamed affectionately Moses, was another one of these influences while I was learning. And I had a unique experience working. I actually went to work at his Labor and Few Ministries, the place where I had gone through rehab at. And I was in charge of the men's dorm a year after I'd gotten saved. And so I was able to spend 2.5 years there, just helping the ministry out and growing in my walk with God. So I would have 3 or 4 hours a day where that was my time where I could just read scripture and pray. And then we were always involved in community stuff. We were always involved in doing ministry. So ministry, full-time ministry, really became my life from the get-go. I mean, from the first day I got saved for the next 3 years. I mean, it became this huge self-encompassing thing to where I just became engrossed in it. And I didn't realize it at the time, but God was preparing me to go into the ministry. And I couldn't believe it at the time. And he didn't reveal it to me until later on, about 2 or 3 years after that 3-year stint. But I had an inkling that something was going on that was bigger than me, basically, at the time. And so there was a lot of growing going on. It was just such an exciting time, and to just be clean and sober during that time too was just, I hadn't been sober since I was a kid. I mean, so I had a lot of growing up to do during that time too. There's a study that goes something like, when you start using drugs, emotionally and mentally, it kind of stunts your growth at that point. And so when you get sober, you're emotionally and mentally, there's a part of you that's still left back at that area, and that's true. So I had some growing up to do. Personally, I had some growing up to do. Spiritually, I had a lot of growing up to do as well. So a lot of changes going on at that time. Yeah.
What what was the transition from working in the men's dorm to becoming a pastor one day?
Yeah. So,
and the sanctification process along the way.
Yeah. So that's I got into the ministry in a weird way, and I got into being a pastor in a weird way too. And it had to happen like that for me just because I'm weird, I guess. I mean, it was just one of these things that God really does work with individuals in a personal way. And so many times when I meet people that are in the ministry, they're in the ministry because they grew up in a certain denomination, and that denomination kind of groomed them to go into the ministry. So they have that kind of theology, they have that kind of personal belief system, they have that ideal when it goes into ministry. Ministry is supposed to be done kind of this way. Well, none of that happened for me. For me, I read scripture for 3.5, 4 years and really developed the theology based on what I felt like the Holy Spirit was telling me, and in my personal studies as I read. So I kind of had this grassroots theology, and then I went looking for a denomination that kind of lined up with what God had, was doing me. Well, so many times it happens, the exact opposite. So I went to school, and by this time I had met my second wife, who was my wife now, and she was working, and we just decided that I was going to go back to school. I had gotten a job after I left the ministry. I had gotten a job in sales again because that's all I'd known. But we really felt like God was calling me into the ministry. So I went back to school and finished a 4-year degree in 3 years. And then we just kind of waited for God to move. We were part of a church that we loved at that time, and I sensed God was calling us into church planting. And so we started dealing with some church plants, and we were dealing in church revitalization. So after I graduated from John Wesley College, a little Bible school in High Point, and had gotten my degree, we just kind of sat and waited for what God was doing. And then God called us down to North Myrtle Beach in a little church down the road from here. And so we went there. We were there for 6 years, and some wonderful things happened. But then we just ended up growing through our time there, and then we moved here to Waterbrook, and we've been at Waterbrook ever since. But the idea of what God was doing at that time, God had to overcome so many of my insecurities. At first, when God first called me to the ministry, David, I was sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to be a youth pastor because, I'm crazy, I'm weird, I think off the wall, I'm ADHD, I get along with teenagers, and so that's what I'm going to be. In the middle of when I'm in school, God starts to do this work in me, saying, no, I don't want you to be a youth pastor. I want you to focus on being a senior pastor. And then I was sitting there thinking, I can't be a senior pastor, Lord, because I have to preach every Sunday, and I'm scared to get in front of people and talk. When you have insecurities, they say the greatest fear in the world for most people is getting up in front of a big crowd of people and speaking. Well, when you have insecurities and you pile that on top of that normal fear, then but God was just not leaving me alone with it. So I finally said, all right, I've trusted you with everything else. I'm going to trust you with this, but I got a bad feeling this is not going to turn out really well. Well, God was up to something at that time, and we didn't know it at the time. I had no clue. If God would have told me that 5 years earlier when I first got saved, I probably would have ran from him and kept running and would probably still be running. So it's, we say that thing about God's timing in all things. And, the last 10 years we've been here at Waterbrook have been wonderful as far as what we're seeing in the community and what we're seeing in the lives of families that we're dealing with here too. So it's been, now I look back on it, it's been 22, 23 years in ministry. Yeah. So, and it seems like yesterday some days. Yeah.
What would the Scott Smith sleeping in his car during the ice storm say if someone were to come to him and say that he would be a pastor one day?
I would have probably wanted whatever you were smoking at that day. It just shows me God's got a great sense of humor. I mean, if he can use somebody like me, I go to that story about Balaam and his donkey talks to him. I'm like, if he can use Balaam's ass, he can use anything. I mean, then I guess I got a chance. Because for me, it just goes to show that God can use anybody in any circumstance at any time. The only key to it for me is you have to make yourself available to God, and in order to do that, you have to submit 100%. And I feel like for sometimes that is so scary because there's this factor of the unknown. You know, you don't know what you're going to get. But for me, it was pretty easy when it came to the unknown because I had been living in the unknown for 5 or 6 years. And for some people, especially drug addicts that have hit rock bottom and living on the street, in some ways, I think it's easier in those regards because you've been living in the unknown for so long that you just look at it like, what's another unknown, you know? And this one's got God attached to it, to where the other one had me attached to it. So, and my best thinking got me sleeping in my car in an ice storm. So I'm up for somebody else doing the thinking during this process. So yeah, I wouldn't believe you. I wouldn't believe you. I still don't believe it now some days, you know. I get to do exactly what I love. I get to work with great people. We get to help people that are in my situation that I used to be in 20 some years ago. We get to stay plugged in to people that are living in the midst of their own personal struggles, either whether cycles of destructive behavior, addictions, dysfunctional relationships, whatever the case may be. But you get to be able to do life with people, and that to me is probably the greatest benefit of ministry when you're talking about the aspect of doing the Lord's work, as people say. To me, it's just trying to put hands and feet on what Jesus told us to do in the gospel. So, yeah.
So from someone who's been there, what would be your biggest piece of advice, or I guess words for people going through addiction, Christian or not, people with faith and without faith?
Well, for people without faith, like where I was, I guess for me, I think, and we deal at our church too, two of the biggest groups of people we target, and we do it intentionally when I say the word target. We look for people that are unchurched, and we look for people that are de-churched, and what I mean by that is people that have been burned by churches, either when they were little or they just don't see the point of it. And for me, I would give you the advice that you don't have to believe the whole Bible in order to start following Jesus or to try to give Jesus a chance. I think sometimes we get caught up in the stigma of, well, I don't understand the whole Noah the ark. I don't understand the whole 7 days of creation. I don't get all that. God's not asking you to do that. He's just asking you to say, can you follow Jesus? And the rest of that can come at a later date too. Or I would say this too, to some people that have maybe been in church but have been burned by churches too. Churches, in a sense, they don't have anything to do with following Jesus, in the sense that it's that personal relationship. Yeah, you can be a Christian and not go to church. I wouldn't recommend it. I think you're going to need that fellowship and stuff too. So there's that aspect. But don't let an experience you had, or a negative experience you had with one person or a group of people, affects you from not going to church from here on out. That would be like me saying, well, I had a bad relationship with a woman once, so therefore I'm never going to date another woman. Well, it's not sensible. But I think we do that sometimes with churches, and we do it because we're either running for something, or we don't want to face something. We're trying to hide something, in a sense, to where we don't want to face maybe something that we think we're fearful of, that God's going to expose, or that God's going to ask us to give up, or that God's going to ask us to do. And so for me, I would say, listen, you don't have to, you don't have to get into all the semantics of church stuff, or you don't have to get into the whole idea of I have to understand the whole Bible in order to give Jesus a chance. So I think for some people, it can become so much easier if you just say, you know what, I'm just going to try to follow Jesus. I'm just going to look at the story of Jesus, and I'm just going to try to follow his words, and I'll let the rest of that stuff come. Because there are lots of Christians that started out, even in the early church, Well, they didn't believe the whole Old Testament. Some of them didn't even know there was an Old Testament. You know, there are Greeks and Romans. They had no idea that the Jews had a whole Bible. So, you know, they just heard that Jesus had been resurrected, and they were like, well, I got to know about this guy. And they started following Jesus just on that little bit of information, and then let the rest of it come to them. And that's exactly what we can do too. Yeah, that would be my greatest advice. Because I think for me, when I was coming from my addiction and stuff too, that was one of the things I had to feel like I had to make sense of the whole Bible before I could finally come to know Jesus. And I didn't. That's not what God was asking me to do. He was just asking me, can I just commit to Jesus? So that would be my bit of advice, I guess, to you. Yeah.
That's awesome. I think that's it as far as the questions go. Is there anything else you would like to add?
You know, I guess the only thing I'd like to add is that when we're talking about transformation, when you're talking about redemption, when you're talking about turning your life around, wherever that may be, whether it's addictions or destructive cycles of behavior, dysfunctional relationships, even depression and stuff too, there's hope. And if somebody like myself can get to the point, and life's not perfect. I mean, you know, life's never going to be perfect either. We've been through our own struggles. We've been through our own tragedies. I mean, we lost our 13-year-old son 6 years ago in a car accident. So, you know, listen, life still goes on, and there's lots of struggles that have to be kind of tackled when it comes to that too. But there is hope, and you can believe in that. You can find that. For me, my hope comes through Christ Jesus. You know, it comes through Jesus Christ. And that was the thing out of everything I tried, and I tried a bunch. Out of everything I tried, that was the steadfast, most constant thing in my life that gave my life purpose, that gave my life meaning, that gave my life everything that it has now. Everything I was secretly yearning for came to fruition with Christ Jesus. And by making that full commitment, not playing the game of it, but making the full commitment of it. And that's what I would urge people, because you can play church and you're not going to get anything else out of it other than whatever you're playing, you know. But when you make that full commitment, the payoff on the other end of that is so much more than you had to put into it. And I would just encourage people to get by that fear and step into that. Yeah, step into that.